Ethan had taken Rex through that park hundreds of times, but the entire world seemed to stop when his disciplined service dog suddenly tore free and sprinted toward a black stranger the town already judged without reason. Instead of fear, the stranger knelt, whispering Rex's name with a familiarity that pierced straight through Ethan's confusion. Then the man looked up and quietly mentioned something Ethan had never told a soul, a classified detail from a mission Ethan barely remembered. In that instant, Ethan knew this wasn't a mistake. Someone had erased the truth, and Rex had just exposed the first crack in the lie. Rex ran toward the black stranger the entire town judged without ever knowing him. Ethan Ward had grown used to the quiet rhythm of the southern town he lived in, a place where time moved slowly and judgment moved quickly. The streets were lined with old brick buildings and hours-long silences. But beneath the stillness lived something sharper, something colder. It showed itself in the way certain people were watched, avoided, or quietly pushed aside. The town rarely spoke of racism openly, yet it shaped the atmosphere the same way humidity shaped the summer air. Ethan had spent years observing this unspoken division, though he rarely participated in it. He preferred to keep to himself, moving through life with a careful slowness that made each day feel survivable. Ethan's world revolved around routine, and at the center of that routine was Rex. The dog moved with precision and purpose, responding to Ethan's subtle shifts in breathing, posture, and mood. Rex grounded him when invisible memories threatened to surface, memories Ethan carried alone since returning from deployment. The townspeople saw the dog as nothing more than a well-trained companion, unaware of the weight he kept balanced within Ethan's mind. When Ethan's thoughts grew heavy or the past pressed too closely, Rex steadied him like an anchor in churning waters. Ethan's reliance on Rex didn't bother him. It comforted him to know that something in his life remained predictable. The town's silent prejudices were predictable too. He saw them each time a black visitor passed through, each time an unfamiliar face appeared in a neighborhood that preferred familiarity over fairness. People would cross the street without admitting why, slow their steps without acknowledging the fear driving them. It was not loud hatred, but a quiet, practiced avoidance that told its own story. On an early fall afternoon, Ethan walked the familiar path through the Central Park. Leaves shifted under Rex's paws, and the air smelled faintly of distant rain. Ethan moved at his usual pace, slow but steady, keeping his thoughts focused on breathing, movement, and the warm presence at his side. The park was scattered with locals, families, older couples, clusters of men who sat on benches every day at the same time, talking about nothing and everything. Their eyes drifted toward anyone who didn't belong, lingering longest on those the town quietly labeled as outsiders. Ethan noticed the stranger before Rex did. A black man stood near the old stone fountain, hands in his pockets, posture calm and still. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just watching the water, letting the afternoon pass. But the people nearby kept glancing at him as though waiting for a reason to be concerned. Ethan felt that familiar, uncomfortable weight of the town's judgment pressing into the scene. He had no intention of approaching the man. He preferred solitude and avoided interactions that demanded emotional energy he didn't have. But Rex had other plans. Without warning, Rex pulled sharply on the leash, breaking into a determined stride. Ethan stumbled forward, caught off guard by the force. Rex had never done this. Not once in all the years Ethan had walked with him. The dog was disciplined, controlled, unwavering in training. Yet now he moved with purpose toward the stranger, as though drawn by something old and familiar. Ethan called to him, but Rex didn't slow down. Conversations in the park halted. People turned. Some stood, ready to misinterpret the moment through the lens they always used. Ethan felt the tension ripple outward, a mix of confusion and the quiet prejudice the town kept tucked beneath polite smiles. The idea that Rex might approach the stranger with aggression formed instantly in their minds, though Rex had never shown aggression toward anyone. The stranger didn't move. He watched Rex with an expression that didn't show fear, but something else, something closer to recognition. His eyes softened the moment Rex reached him, and the dog stopped abruptly, lowering himself into a seated position directly at the man's feet. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Rex behaved as if he had found someone he trusted deeply, someone he had been waiting for. Ethan slowed as he approached, breath unsteady. He tried to make sense of the moment, but confusion clouded everything. Rex had never acted this way toward any person in town. For him to ignore commands, to bolt toward a complete stranger, it unsettled Ethan in ways he couldn't explain. The stranger's posture remained calm, but the look in his eyes carried layers Ethan couldn't read. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching the man with quiet familiarity, as though he had returned to a place that once brought him comfort. Ethan felt a strange shift inside himself, an awareness that something meaningful was unfolding. The stranger didn't lean down or reach out. He simply looked at Rex with a recognition too sharp to dismiss. Ethan's pulse quickened as he finally reached them, the scattered whispers of the crowd fading into background noise. There was something in the stranger's expression, something that made Ethan feel as though he had stepped into a memory he didn't fully recall. It wasn't fear, or surprise, or confusion. It was recognition. The stranger said Rex's name before Ethan could speak a word. For a moment, the sound of it hung in the air, quiet yet impossibly certain, carrying a familiarity that struck Ethan harder than the crisp autumn breeze moving through the park. The man's voice wasn't loud, but it was steady in a way that suggested he wasn't guessing. He knew the name. He knew it with a kind of confidence that didn't come from chance or coincidence. Ethan's chest tightened, confusion folding into a deeper unease as he stared at the stranger, trying to understand how someone he had never met could speak the name of the one companion he had trusted more than anyone. The stranger, now clearly far more than a passerby, stood with a stillness that felt intentional. His eyes carried stories within them, heavy ones, layered and unspoken. There was a gentleness in his posture, yet behind it lived something worn down by time, as though life had tested him repeatedly and left marks that didn't show on the surface. Ethan finally noticed the subtle signs, the slight stiffness in the man's shoulders, the controlled breathing, the way he anchored himself in place. They were signs Ethan recognized instantly, carved into him through years of training and trauma. This man had been through things only someone familiar with chaos would understand. The crowd watched with narrowed eyes and whispered assumptions, though their reactions came not from concern, but from prejudice. Some took small steps back, others stiffened in quiet disapproval, and a few simply stared with the sharpness of people searching for a fault that didn't exist. They didn't see a veteran who carried burdens. They saw a black man in a place that rarely welcomed difference. Ethan sensed it, the way the atmosphere thickened with unspoken judgment. It made the moment feel even heavier, as though the man was standing beneath not just the weight of his past, but the weight of the town's quiet hostility. Rex, the stranger repeated softly, as if confirming a truth only he remembered. Rex's body remained still beside him, calm yet alert, his eyes locked on the man with unmistakable recognition. Ethan had never seen his dog behave this way, not even around people he trusted. The loyalty in Rex's posture, the peaceful ease in his breathing, it was too familiar, too immediate, too real to ignore. Ethan managed to find his voice, though it felt thin at first. He tried to call Rex back to his side, but the dog didn't move. The refusal wasn't defiant. It was instinctive, as though Rex had returned to someone who had once been part of his world. The stranger didn't reach down to pet him or coax him closer. He simply stood there, letting the moment unfold, allowing Rex to choose freely. Ethan felt his heartbeat pick up, not from fear, but from the slow realization that something about his dog's past might not be what he believed. The man finally introduced himself, offering a name that carried both strength and quiet sorrow. Caleb Rivers. His tone was measured, almost cautious, as though he wasn't sure how Ethan would react. Ethan repeated the name silently, trying to connect it to a memory, but nothing surfaced. Caleb watched him closely, not with suspicion, but with the kind of attentiveness someone develops when they've spent years expecting disbelief. Caleb mentioned a military base, one Ethan had once served at, saying it with such precision that Ethan felt the ground shift beneath the conversation. It wasn't a base people casually referenced, nor was it a detail Ethan ever shared with anyone in town. He kept that part of his life locked away, buried beneath routines and silence. The townspeople had no idea where he had trained, and he preferred it that way. Yet here was a stranger speaking of it without hesitation, as if recalling a place that still lived vividly in his mind. A complicated mix of emotions tightened inside Ethan: confusion, curiosity, and the uncomfortable spark of recognition he couldn't quite grasp. There was something deeply unsettling about hearing fragments of his past from a man he couldn't remember. The familiarity in Caleb's voice, the way he seemed to know the details Ethan had forced himself to forget, it all made Ethan feel exposed, as if pieces of a story he had buried were resurfacing without his permission. Caleb's gaze drifted to Rex for a moment before returning to Ethan. He spoke carefully, saying Rex belonged to a history deeper than the version Ethan was given. He didn't elaborate, didn't reveal everything, but the implications sat heavily between them. A truth existed, one Ethan had never been briefed on, one that tied the stranger to his dog in ways he could not explain. The idea unsettled Ethan, sparking a quiet unease that mixed with the faint pull of memory scratching at the edges of his mind. Rex remained at Caleb's feet, choosing him without hesitation, as though their bond had never been severed. Ethan felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Jealousy, perhaps, or fear that he never fully understood the dog who protected him so fiercely. Caleb watched Rex with a look of familiarity, not surprise, suggesting that this reunion was anything but accidental. Caleb finally spoke words that sent a chill through Ethan, not because they were threatening, but because they carried too much truth to dismiss. He revealed that he once served with a soldier who looked exactly like Ethan, a soldier who existed in memories but not in official records, a soldier whose name had been erased from files that were never supposed to change. Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs as Caleb finished speaking, and in the silence that followed, the weight of the moment settled into something undeniable. Something in their shared past was missing, something important, something deliberately erased. Caleb described a mission Ethan could barely remember, even though he was there. Ethan felt the world tilt slightly as Caleb began to speak, not with urgency, but with the slow, careful precision of someone who had carried a truth alone for far too long. The park's noise faded into a soft murmur behind them, and the air grew strangely still. Caleb's voice held a weight that drew Ethan inward, pulling him through layers of memory he had long stopped trying to access. The mention of a mission, a deployment, a place Ethan had tried to bury beneath years of silence. It all cracked open a part of his mind he had guarded fiercely. Caleb explained that he had served as a medic embedded within Ethan's unit during a classified operation that was never openly discussed, not in reports, not in briefings, not even in the stories exchanged among soldiers after returning home. The deployment wasn't one Ethan had ever talked about, mostly because the memories around it were blurred and fragmented, slipping away each time he tried to grasp them. Caleb's calm recounting didn't sound rehearsed or embellished. It sounded lived, like something etched under his skin. Ethan felt a faint tremor of recognition, the kind that stirred from deep within the body rather than the mind. As Caleb continued, Ethan felt the edges of suppressed recollections press against him, quick flashes that came and vanished too quickly to fully understand. He saw dust rising through thick air, heard muffled screams, sensed the chaos of a day he thought had been swallowed by time. The fragments cut through him like short bursts of light. Caleb crouched beside wounded soldiers, steady hands working under pressure. Rex, much younger, alerting to something unseen, shadows shifting in the distance, orders shouted with urgency. These pieces didn't arrange themselves into a complete picture, but they carried the unmistakable heaviness of truth. Caleb went deeper, describing moments from the mission where he had tried to warn the commanding officers about structural vulnerabilities, potential ambush points, and environmental risks that could jeopardize the whole unit. But those warnings were ignored, not because they lacked insight or accuracy, but because they came from him. The undertones weren't subtle. Caleb was dismissed repeatedly, treated as though his presence was optional rather than essential, and his contributions minimized by officers who pretended not to hear him unless they needed someone to shoulder blame. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest as he listened, realizing these weren't just memories of war. They were memories shaped by bias, buried beneath layers of silence. Caleb spoke about the explosion that changed everything, the moment that had fractured Ethan's recollection of the mission. There were details Ethan had never remembered clearly, not the cause, not the sequence, not the aftermath. Caleb described how he had been close enough to shield 2 soldiers and drag another to safety, moving through smoke thick enough to blur the world into shifting shadows. Ethan felt a distant echo of the blast in his mind, a pressure that once knocked the breath from his chest. Caleb explained that Ethan had been thrown off his feet, momentarily unconscious, and by the time he woke, nothing looked the same. The memory of that moment had always been a hollow space inside Ethan, a place his mind refused to navigate. Rex's part in the mission became clearer too. Caleb described how the dog had been trained for early detection and emotional support long before Ethan ever received him. During the mission, Rex had bonded with Caleb first, responding to his grounded presence in the middle of chaos, imprinting on him through shared trauma and proximity. It was the kind of bond dogs didn't forget easily. Ethan felt something shift inside him at that revelation, a blend of sadness and understanding. Rex's instinctive pull toward Caleb wasn't confusion or chance. It was memory, buried deeper than anything Ethan had been told. The more Caleb spoke, the more Ethan sensed that his memory loss wasn't simply a consequence of trauma. The details Caleb provided aligned with the blank spaces Ethan had tried to accept, spaces that felt too clean, too structured, as though someone had intentionally removed pieces, rather than letting them fade naturally. The omissions in Ethan's recollection began to resemble the omissions Caleb described in the official accounts: erased lines, missing names, adjusted narratives that favored certain soldiers while silencing others. It unsettled Ethan to realize he might have lived years believing a story shaped not by truth, but by decisions made far above him. Caleb's voice remained steady as he revealed the darkest part of it. He had been erased from the mission entirely. His reports, his warnings, his contributions, they were removed from the record. His name was absent from documents where it should have appeared, replaced by empty acknowledgments that mentioned medical personnel, without specifying who. It wasn't a clerical oversight. It was an intentional exclusion born from deeply rooted racial bias that had followed him throughout his service, ultimately shaping the narrative of a mission that had nearly taken Ethan's life. As the truth settled between them, Ethan felt something inside him loosen, as though a knot he never knew existed had finally been pulled. He saw not just the weight Caleb carried, but the responsibility pressed onto his own shoulders. There were survivors, Caleb said, but only one had seen everything from the center of the chaos. Most of the unit was gone, scattered by time or tragedy. Records could be altered, memories could be buried, and truths could be reshaped by those with power. But firsthand, witnesses were harder to silence. Caleb took a breath, his eyes steady and unwavering as he looked at Ethan, with a clarity that cut through the quiet tension surrounding them. He told Ethan that he was the last surviving witness who could confirm what truly happened on that mission. And if Ethan couldn't remember, the truth risked disappearing forever. Ethan suddenly remembered why Caleb's name was never supposed to be spoken again. The realization arrived not as a single image, but as a slow, unwinding sequence of memories that had been locked so deeply within him that they felt foreign at first, like scenes from someone else's life. His breath tightened as the past began to push through the fog that had clouded it for years. Caleb's voice, steady and unshaken, seemed to guide those memories back into place, urging them to reconnect with the truth Ethan had spent so long unknowingly avoiding. The first memory came in fragments, soft dust swirling in the air, the muffled chaos of a mission no one had ever fully recounted, and Caleb moving with a calmness that cut through the tension around them. Ethan remembered seeing Caleb pull exhausted soldiers toward safer ground, not with force or panic, but with the grounded reassurance of someone who understood how fragile a moment could be. The memory wasn't violent. It was protective, centered on Caleb's presence, his focus, his insistence that every man under his watch mattered. Ethan now recognized that those actions had been clearer than anything recorded in official logs. They were acts of care, not aggression, and they were precisely the moments that had been erased. Another memory surfaced with startling clarity, an officer watching Caleb with a resentment that had nothing to do with performance or mission objective. Ethan could now see the expression in the officer's eyes, an irritation sharpened by bias, an unwillingness to accept warnings coming from a man he refused to respect. Caleb had spoken with precision, offering assessments based on training and instinct, but the officer responded with dismissive nods, forced patience, and comments tinged with thinly disguised prejudice. Ethan had not fully understood it at the time. He had been too focused on his own role to see the pattern forming, but now the truth threaded itself through every recollection. Caleb had been undermined, not because of what he said, but because of who he was. The weight of this truth pressed heavily on Ethan. He felt an ache of guilt, the kind that grew slowly once it rooted itself in the mind. He realized now that he had been protected by a system that rewarded silence and didn't question convenience. Files had been written in his favor, narratives shaped to elevate some while quietly excluding others. He had existed inside a version of events crafted to keep certain people invisible, and he had lived years believing the curated story without ever knowing who paid the cost for it. Caleb's absence from the record wasn't an oversight. It had been intentional, a product of decisions made by people who would never face the consequences of their choices. Caleb spoke again, voice steady, explaining that he had searched for Ethan for years, not because he expected gratitude or recognition, but because Ethan's memory was the missing link needed to uncover the truth that had been buried so deliberately. Caleb's life had been reshaped by that mission. He had been dismissed, discarded, and left with the knowledge that the truth existed, but could not be proven without someone else who had lived it. Ethan felt the weight of that responsibility settle into him, shaping itself into something he couldn't ignore. Rex moved closer to Ethan, sensing the shift in his breathing, the tension in his shoulders, the rising uncertainty. Awe of the dog's presence grounded him, guiding him gently through the emotional storm building inside. Rex positioned himself between the two men, not to separate them, but as a steadying force, his instincts honed by years of sensing the unspoken. His loyalty was unwavering, and Ethan felt it like a lifeline pulling him back to balance. As the memories continued to piece themselves together, Ethan recalled a moment that had remained buried longer than anything else. He remembered a conversation, quiet, quick, and edged with authority, where the same resentful officer had spoken to another member of the unit about adjusting reports. The instructions were clear. Remove certain details, omit certain names, simplify narratives in ways that aligned better with expectations. Ethan hadn't understood the implications then, too consumed by physical recovery and emotional disorientation. But now, with clarity rising inside him, it became undeniable. The officer had specifically ordered that Caleb's presence, contributions, and decisions be excluded from all official accounts. It wasn't just unfair, it was deliberate erasure. Ethan felt a slow burn of realization move through him, not as anger, but as a deep, heavy recognition of the truth Caleb had lived with for years. It wasn't only Caleb who had been silenced, it was the memory of the mission itself, reshaped into something incomplete, missing its most critical witness. Ethan knew now that the fracture in his memories wasn't just trauma, it was the absence of truth. Caleb watched him carefully, giving him space to absorb what resurfaced. There was no pressure in his expression, no demand that Ethan respond quickly. Instead, he waited with the patience of someone who had learned that truth couldn't be forced. It had to be remembered. And then, in a quiet breath, Caleb said the name Ethan had not expected to hear. He named the officer who had orchestrated the erasure, the man who had shaped the false narrative that lasted for years. Colonel Thomas Briggs, the same man who lived only a few streets away. Ethan finally saw the man everyone respected, and Caleb feared for good reason. The walk toward Colonel Thomas Briggs's neighborhood felt heavier than Ethan expected, as if each step carried the weight of truth gathering behind him. The town streets, familiar and quiet, took on a different tone, now that Ethan knew what lay beneath its surface. The people who waved when he passed, the neighbors who spoke fondly of the colonel, the veterans who praised his leadership, they had all contributed unknowingly to a story built on carefully constructed falsehoods. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath his sense of belonging. It was unsettling to realize he had walked among these people for years without seeing the layers of bias they upheld, even without intending to. Caleb walked beside him, with a calm that didn't quite hide the tension simmering underneath. There was an old weight in Caleb's expression, something that spoke of memories he had carried for far too long without validation. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was the anticipation of facing someone who had stolen more from him than any mission ever had. Caleb's steps were steady, but his eyes carried the guarded awareness of someone preparing to confront a ghost that had lived too long in silence. Ethan tried to hold his breathing steady as they approached the neighborhood's edge. The houses here looked pristine, well kept, lined with manicured lawns and quiet porches. People greeted one another with the kind of small-town familiarity that implied trust. A trust Ethan now knew had been misplaced. Colonel Briggs wasn't just respected here. He was admired, even revered. His military service woven into local pride like a symbol of everything the town believed represented strength. That pride had blinded them. It had blinded Ethan, too. As they moved closer to Briggs's home, Ethan felt the old memory of the officer's face surface with stinging clarity. The resentment in Briggs's eyes during the mission briefing, the way his voice sharpened when Caleb spoke, the dismissive gestures disguised as impatience, it all made sense now. Briggs had never wanted Caleb there, not because of competence, but because Caleb challenged the myth he relied on. Ethan remembered the way Briggs always seemed irritated by Caleb's presence, as though Caleb disrupted a narrative he worked hard to maintain. Ethan's lungs tightened with the recognition that he had been part of a system that enabled this, even if unknowingly. It was a realization that brought guilt curling into his chest, a painful awareness of how silence could be as damaging as action. Caleb held a folder tucked under his arm, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside were documents he had tried to present before, mission reports with missing signatures, medical evaluations that proved his presence, inconsistencies that revealed how deliberately someone had removed him from the narrative. Ethan had glanced at some earlier, and each page had carried the unmistakable imprint of manipulation. Lines crossed out, sections rewritten, names omitted. Caleb shouldn't have needed these papers to prove who he was, yet here he was, forced to carry evidence of his own worth like a shield. Ethan struggled with the knowledge that while his own name had been upheld in these reports, Caleb's had been erased. Ethan had been praised for surviving a mission he barely remembered, while Caleb had been written out completely. The imbalance was sharp and uncomfortable, settling into his conscience with a weight he knew wouldn't leave easily. He had lived in the safety of a story others built for him, while Caleb had lived in the shadow of a truth he was never allowed to claim. Ethan found himself wishing he had realized earlier, wishing he had asked more questions, wishing he had seen what Caleb had endured before being forced to face it this way. Rex walked slightly ahead of them, but his posture communicated what Ethan felt: tension, awareness, caution. The dog's ears were forward, his gaze fixed on Briggs's house, as if recognizing the energy surrounding it. Rex wasn't aggressive, he never had been, but he was alert, his movements precise and deliberate. It was clear he sensed something significant in the air, something Ethan couldn't ignore. Rex's instincts rarely failed him, and now those instincts aligned with everything Ethan felt tightening inside. As Briggs's house came fully into view, Ethan slowed unconsciously, drawn into a mix of anticipation and unease. The house stood confidently on its corner lot, its porch decorated with patriotic symbols that reflected the reputation Briggs maintained in town. Everything about the place spoke of a man who took pride in his past, a past Ethan knew now was only half the truth. The decorations, the plaques by the door, the flags waving lightly in the breeze, they created the illusion of honor, covering the darker reality beneath. Caleb paused beside him, taking a breath that felt heavy with years of waiting. They hadn't even knocked yet, but Ethan could feel the significance of the moment pressing on all three of them. Ethan, Caleb, and Rex, like a threshold that once crossed, could never be stepped back over. Ethan glanced at Caleb, noticing the quiet resolve in his expression. Caleb hadn't come here for confrontation. He had come for recognition, for truth, for the chance to reclaim what had been taken from him. They stepped onto the porch together, the wooden boards creaking softly under their weight. Ethan lifted his hand toward the door, preparing to knock, though he wasn't sure what to expect from the man on the other side. Before his knuckles met the wood, the door swung open with a smoothness that sent a chill through him. Colonel Thomas Briggs stood there, his expression composed and unreadable, and in his eyes was the unmistakable look of someone who already knew exactly why they had come. Briggs greeted them with a smile that hid the same hatred he carried on the battlefield. The expression on Colonel Thomas Briggs's face was calm, polished, and perfectly rehearsed. The kind of smile crafted over years of shaking hands, receiving medals, and convincing people that he was the embodiment of discipline and honor. But beneath that practiced charm lived something darker. Ethan felt it immediately in the subtle stiffness of Briggs's eyes, in the slight tension around his jaw, in the shallow breath he took before stepping aside, as if granting them the privilege of entering. Caleb felt it too. His posture shifted just enough to show he recognized the hostility woven into the man's politeness. The air inside the house carried the smell of old wood and framed pride. Certificates, photographs, medals arranged neatly along the walls as though each one existed to reinforce a narrative Briggs had spent years perfecting. Briggs began speaking with a tone drenched in false warmth, addressing Ethan first as though Caleb were merely a shadow behind him. He asked about Ethan's recovery, about how life had treated him since the deployment. But the moment his gaze slid toward Caleb, the friendliness thinned into subtle disdain. His words were polite, but the undertones pulsed with quiet dismissal, as if Caleb's presence was an inconvenience rather than a rightful part of the conversation. Briggs didn't need to raise his voice or speak cruelly. The prejudice rested in the way he emphasized certain words, in the slight narrowing of his eyes, in the soft laugh that conveyed superiority rather than humor. Caleb answered with steady composure, not rising to the bait, not showing the slightest sign of the years of damage Briggs's decisions had caused. His calmness didn't come from fear or defeat. It came from resilience, from surviving long enough to confront the man responsible for rewriting the truth. Briggs tilted his head slightly, sensing that Caleb's resolve was stronger than he expected. His smile tightened at the edges, revealing irritation beneath the charm. Then Briggs began recounting the mission, twisting it, reshaping it, bending it into the version he had spent years protecting. He spoke about the chaos, the confusion, the tactical errors, each word carefully selected to place blame on Caleb in ways that sounded official but held no substance. He implied that Caleb had misjudged threats, mismanaged injuries, and acted unpredictably under pressure, all while presenting himself as the heroic officer forced to maintain control. Ethan listened, feeling a slow, rising heaviness as he compared Briggs's claims to the memories Caleb had helped him recover. The discrepancies were unmistakable. Briggs wasn't just misremembering, he was manipulating, reshaping events to preserve the image he valued more than truth. Ethan noticed the subtle shifts in Briggs's demeanor whenever Caleb corrected a detail. Briggs's smile hardened, his tone cooled, his compliments became barbed, wrapped in an authority meant to shut down opposition. Ethan had once admired this man, had once believed his leadership was unquestionable. Now, watching him dance around lies with such confidence, Ethan felt something inside him crack. This was the man who had controlled the narrative for years, insisting he knew best, while quietly burying anything or anyone who challenged him. Caleb remained steady, his voice controlled, refusing to be pulled into Briggs' verbal traps. He didn't defend himself in desperation. He presented facts calmly, remembering details Briggs hadn't expected him to hold. His clarity unnerved Briggs, whose smile flickered each time Caleb dismantled another lie. There was something quietly powerful in Caleb's restraint, in the way he held truth, not as a weapon, but as proof of survival. Ethan felt a slow admiration grow inside him, mingled with guilt that he had once believed the narrative Briggs built. Rex, who had been silent during most of the exchange, shifted unexpectedly. His muscles tensed, his tail lowered, and a low sound formed deep in his chest. Not aggressive, not threatening, but unmistakably protective. Ethan froze, surprised. Rex never reacted this way unless he sensed emotional distress or underlying danger. The dog's instinct had always been precise, attuned to the unspoken. Now, as Rex locked eyes on Briggs, Ethan realized the truth. Rex remembered something about this man, something unpleasant, something tied to the mission Ethan was only beginning to understand. Briggs's smile faltered when he noticed the dog shift, and for a moment, his carefully crafted mask slipped, trying to regain control. Briggs stepped toward a nearby drawer with an air of superiority, pulling out a thin, sealed envelope. He held it between his fingers with a theatrical confidence, as though he were revealing a final, decisive piece of evidence meant to crush Caleb's credibility. With a tone dripping in condescension, he claimed the envelope contained proof that Caleb had been the problem during the mission, proof that the military had been right to dismiss him. Briggs delivered the words slowly, savoring the implication that he still held the power to shape the truth. Ethan felt the room tighten around them, the tension gathering like storm clouds. Caleb's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened with the weight of everything Briggs had taken from him. The envelope felt symbolic, a false truth sealed in paper, constructed by a man desperate to hold on to the version of events that benefited him. Ethan took the envelope from Briggs, the paper cold against his fingers, aware that whatever lay inside wouldn't just challenge Caleb's story, it would challenge his own understanding of the past. Before anyone spoke again, Briggs leaned back with smug confidence, certain he had regained control of the moment. But the truth, Ethan realized, was shifting in the opposite direction. Briggs claimed the envelope held everything they needed to understand what truly happened. Ethan felt the air thicken with the weight of the coming revelation as he stared at the sealed edges, knowing the truth inside would either destroy the past or finally expose it. Inside the envelope was the proof that racism, not failure, destroyed Caleb's career. Ethan held the envelope as if it carried something more fragile than paper, feeling the thin weight of it press against his palm. The house behind them seemed to watch as they walked away from Briggs's doorstep, its neat windows reflecting a version of the colonel the town adored. Ethan knew the man inside would likely resume his day as though nothing had changed, confident that whatever he had sealed in that envelope would keep the story in his favor. The distance between the image the town admired and the truth Ethan was about to uncover felt wider than the road they walked. They reached Ethan's home in silence, both men carrying their own storms of thought. Caleb's expression remained composed, but the years behind his eyes were impossible to miss. He had walked through too many rooms where decisions about his life were made without his presence, listened to too many people tell his story without ever asking him to confirm it. This moment, standing in Ethan's kitchen with the envelope resting between them, felt different. For the first time, he was not alone with the truth. Ethan slid a knife gently under the seal and opened the envelope, unfolding the contents with care. There were printed logs, medical notes, and typed statements, each page bearing the official formatting he remembered from his service years. Yet as he scanned the documents, he felt a slow, deep shift in his understanding. These weren't the filtered, polished summaries he had once seen. They were uncensored, untouched by the edits that had rewritten the mission's story. And they proved what Caleb had spent years trying to say. The logs detailed moments Ethan's fragmented memory had only hinted at. They described a medic stabilizing injured soldiers under pressure, directing movement with precision, predicting risks before they unfolded. The language was clinical, but the pattern was unmistakable. Caleb had been central to the unit's survival. His actions were not small, not optional, not forgettable. Yet each time the reports should have named him, the space was left vague. The words medical personnel appeared where his name should have been, as though someone had carefully brushed him out of existence while leaving his work behind. Ethan turned to the medical reports next, reading assessments that confirmed Caleb's presence at key moments. One note described wounds treated by a medic whose identification was inexplicably missing. Another referenced a treatment method specific to Caleb's training, yet no name accompanied it. The gaps were too precise to be coincidence. Everywhere Caleb's hand had been, his name had been removed. The cruelty of it rested not only in the erasure, but in the way his work had been used while his identity had been discarded. The testimonies at the back of the stack were the sharpest to read. Unedited statements from soldiers briefly mentioned a medic with calm hands and sharp instincts, someone who had kept them steady when panic threatened to take over. But in the finalized versions, Ethan remembered those brief mentions had vanished. The uncensored copies in front of him showed what had been taken away. The pattern now stretched across pages, undeniable and deliberate. As the truth settled, Ethan felt a new weight settle on his shoulders, responsibility. He saw clearly that he had lived for years beneath the shelter of a narrative that favored him while crushing someone else. His name had been preserved, praised, and protected by a system that chose which stories deserved to live. Caleb's had been erased not because he failed, but because acknowledging his success would have contradicted the bias woven quietly into decisions made far above them. Ethan realized that by accepting the official version of events without question, he had benefited from the silence. Caleb watched Ethan absorb the information, his expression neither demanding nor detached. When he finally spoke, it was not with anger, but with the tired honesty of someone who had spent too long trying to prove what should have been believed the first time. He described how these missing acknowledgments had followed him, how the lack of recognition had led to lost opportunities, suspicion, and ultimately a career cut short. Each rejection, each closed door, each raised eyebrow when he mentioned his role had slowly carved away at his sense of self. The emotional toll was not a single event. It was a series of quiet injuries that accumulated over years. Outside, the town moved as it always had, unaware of the pages now spread across Ethan's table. But word traveled faster than paper. Briggs's version of the story had begun circulating already, carried in conversations on porches and in small gatherings. Many residents sided with him instinctively, not because they had seen the evidence, but because they trusted the image they had always known. A decorated officer, a familiar face, a white man with status and a carefully preserved record. It was easier for them to accept his version than to question a stranger whose story challenged the way they saw themselves. Ethan felt the sting of that realization. The town's reaction was not surprising, but it was painful. Without even knowing the details, many had decided someone like Caleb had to be mistaken, bitter, or untrustworthy. Their confidence did not come from facts. It came from comfort. Allowing Caleb's truth into their view would require them to admit that the system they upheld could be cruel, and most of them were not ready for that. Through it all, Rex stayed close to Caleb's side, lying with his body angled just slightly toward him, as though guarding a quiet boundary only he understood. Every time Ethan's voice tightened or Caleb's gaze grew distant, Rex's presence seemed to soften the edges of the moment. The dog's loyalty had chosen its place long ago, shaped by a past neither man had fully understood. Now, seeing them together, Ethan felt that bond as something sacred, a reminder that memory lived in more than just paper and recollection. Ethan looked once more at the documents, then at Caleb, then inward at the space where denial might have settled. Instead, he found clarity. The choice before him was simple in form, but heavy in consequence. He could protect the comfortable lie that had shielded him and the town for years, or he could stand beside Caleb and help bring the truth into a world that might resist it. One path preserved his ease. The other honored what was right. He knew which one he could live with. There was still one piece missing, one voice that had to be heard before the truth could stand fully on its own. Ethan gathered the papers, his decision forming with quiet certainty, and told Caleb that there was one more person who needed to speak. The last soldier who had signed the false reports. The last witness finally broke, and the truth set Caleb free. Ethan had expected the visit to Sergeant Hale's home to feel heavy, but he hadn't anticipated the atmosphere that greeted them the moment Hale opened the door. The house felt dim, even with the lights on, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of everything Hale had tried to keep buried. The air smelled faintly of old paper and loneliness, the kind that settled over a person when regret became a daily companion. Hale's posture revealed more truth than his words ever could. His shoulders slumped, his eyes clouded by shadows that had followed him long after the war ended. Ethan recognized that haunted distance, the look of a man holding on to a story he no longer had the strength to protect. Hale ushered them inside with a quiet hesitation, as if bracing himself for the moment he had avoided for years. He glanced at Caleb with a mix of recognition and shame, and the silence between them carried a weight deeper than accusation. Caleb didn't move toward him or greet him with expectation. He simply watched Hale with the calm patience of someone who had waited a long time to be acknowledged, not vindicated. Rex settled beside Caleb instantly, sensing the emotional charge in the room, his posture steady and alert, as if he understood how fragile the next moments might be. Hale took a seat at his worn kitchen table, the wood chipped from years of restless hands and unfinished meals. He stared down for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady. He admitted that he had been expecting them, not because Briggs had warned him, but because guilt had a way of whispering reminders that could not be ignored. Ethan felt the tension in the air grow heavier with every word, knowing that whatever truth Hale had been holding would either confirm what he feared or reveal something even darker. When Hale began to talk, the dam broke slowly. He said Briggs had approached him after the mission, carrying stacks of reports that needed signatures. Hale hadn't understood at first. He thought he was signing standard post-mission documentation, the kind that filled binders no one read again unless required. But as he skimmed the pages, he noticed missing information, details he knew had occurred, moments he remembered vividly. He hesitated, only to have Briggs lean in and insist that the edits were necessary to present a more unified, controlled account. He said it with a confidence that left no room for questioning, a tone that carried the authority of a man used to having his decisions accepted without resistance. Hale confessed that he recognized immediately what was happening. Caleb's name had been removed. Every contribution, every action, every moment Caleb had spent stabilizing soldiers or preventing disaster was absent. It wasn't just a reduction, it was erasure. Hale remembered feeling sick as he read the pages, yet he still signed them, not because he believed in Briggs, but because he feared the consequences of refusing. He spoke of the pressure, the intimidation, the subtle threat behind Briggs's calm explanations. Hale had convinced himself at the time that staying silent was survival. Years later, that silence had rotted into guilt he carried like an invisible wound. As Hale spoke, Caleb listened with the composed intensity of someone hearing the truth he always knew but never had confirmed out loud. Hale admitted that Caleb had been the reason several soldiers survived, including Rex's original handler. He described how Rex, then newer in the field, had gravitated toward Caleb's steadiness, often mirroring his movements and responding to his cues even before training fully took hold. The connection wasn't random. It had been formed during moments of uncertainty, when Caleb's calm presence made the difference between panic and focus. Hale explained how, in the middle of the chaos, Rex had stayed near Caleb, observing him, trusting him. The dog's instincts had imprinted on the one person who moved through crisis with unwavering clarity. That bond had never disappeared. It had simply been paused when the mission ended and their paths separated. Hearing this, Ethan felt a sudden understanding settle in. Rex hadn't misbehaved that day in the park. He had recognized the man who had once anchored him through danger, the man whose presence had shaped part of his instinctive trust. The weight of Hale's confession shifted something deep within the room. Caleb didn't react with triumph or anger. He took a slow breath, absorbing the truth with the quiet grace of someone who had been fighting for recognition long enough to learn patience. Ethan felt a different emotion, an ache for the years Caleb had spent trying to convince others of what should have been clear from the start. He wondered how many times Caleb had been dismissed simply because the truth made people uncomfortable. Hale slid a small folder across the table, copies he had kept for years, the evidence he had been too afraid to reveal, but too guilty to destroy. Inside were notes, handwritten acknowledgments of Caleb's involvement, and fragments of truth Hale had saved as a reminder of what he should have defended. They weren't official, but they were honest, and combined with the documents Ethan and Caleb already had, they formed a narrative too complete to deny. Caleb finally had enough proof to seek reinstatement, acknowledgement, and justice in a system that had once erased him. As the truth spread through the town, reactions shifted uneasily. Some held on to their preconceived beliefs, unwilling to accept that the man they admired had manipulated the truth. But others began to question, whispering among themselves, trying to reconcile what they heard with the reality they had ignored for years. The story began to take root, pushing against the prejudice that had shaped the town's quiet judgments for so long. The morning of Caleb's hearing arrived with a sky washed in early light. Ethan stood beside him in the waiting area, feeling the weight of everything they had uncovered. And then, Without hesitation, Rex walked directly to Caleb's side, settling with the certainty of a bond restored, as if reclaiming the place he was never meant to lose. Sometimes the truth stays buried until someone is brave enough to face it, and stories like this remind us why every voice matters. If this journey moved you even a little, stay connected with us so we can keep bringing hidden truths to light. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps more people hear them. But tell me one thing. If you were in Ethan's place and your dog chose a stranger over you, would you trust the dog's instinct or your own doubt?